right, let's take on perhaps slightly pointless but illustrative task. Here we, in the iteration chapter, we have to iterate a block of code multiple times. That is, execute it multiple times, and that means that we have some process that we wish to undertake more than once. Okay, that's what for loops do for us. So the task in this case is this. Let's sum up the squares of the first n evens. Okay, so the idea then would be something like this. So the first even, of course, is 2, and then the next is 4, and so on. So let us, for instance, do something like 2 squared plus 4 squared plus 6 squared. This would be just one example of the sort of task that we wish to carry out. Of course, we wish it to be more versatile than just that calculation. It could be the first one even, which would be 2 squared, or the first two evens, which would be 2 squared plus 4 squared, or the first three evens, which would be the calculation that you see, and so on. So, of course, we wish to write a function, and the parameter for that function will be the number of evens. And then, well, here's the classic pattern in this chapter. We will initialize a variable, which will hold the final sum by the time that we're done. And then after we initialize that variable, which we'll call something like sum of squares perhaps, after we initialize that variable, we will then initiate a for loop. That is, we'll start up a for loop with the for loop variable in range. And then once we're inside of the for loop, that is, once we're in its body, the chunk of code that we'll execute multiple times, we will update that sum. And then once the for loop is complete, we can actually return the sum. So this is like the classic pattern of the chapter. Initialize the value of a variable, enter into a for loop. Inside the for loop, update the value of that variable multiple times. And then when the for loop is complete, return the value of the variable. All right, so here we go. Here is a function which will, well, I'll just simply sum squares evens. Okay, sum square evens, if I could get the underscore. And then n will represent the number of evens whose sum we wish to produce. So I tell you this, we'll create a variable called sum. Okay, we'll initialize it to 0. And then, how about this? We'll actually create a range. This is another important part of the chapter as well. We'll actually create a range that will give us the evens that we need. Okay, now the range function in Python is really quite useful. It's not perhaps as versatile as it could be. I can imagine it made in a different way, but the way that it works is that it produces what in mathematics sometimes we call arithmetic sequences. And what we mean by an arithmetic sequence is this, is that we start at some value, and then we go up or down by a certain set amount, and then we go up or down by that again, and then we do that a certain number of times. So the difference between successive elements is a constant. That's just how the range function works. So what our range function will do is it will produce evens, and the range function is perfectly capable of that, because to produce the next even, we always increase by the same amount, which is 2. So for even in range, of course, you recall that the for and the n are the keywords. They must be there. What is between them, in this case, the even, that's the loop variable we can choose as we want there. Though in this case, even does make good sense because our range will produce evens. So let us see, what should the range be? Well, this part of the range is for certain correct. Remember that range is start, stop, step. So the start value should be 2. That's the first even. The final value, the 2, that's the step value. And sure enough, to produce the next even, we always step up by 2. But we wish to produce n evens. Okay, so let's think about that a little bit. So if we wish to produce just one even, we should stop at 2, right? That should be the final element of the list. If we want the first 2 evens, well, that should be 2 and 4. If we want the first 3 evens, that should be 2 and 4 and 6 and so on. So one might think that it would be this, right? The stop value would be 2n. Well, let's think about that. So if we want the first even, that is when n is 1, the stop value will be 2. So we will have the range 2, 2, 2. Let's actually see that in the console. The console is great for experimentation. So remember in the console that we have to use the list function to actually see the list. Oh, dang. We got the empty list. So 2, 2, 2 isn't the list that we wanted, because we wanted the list that contained 2. How about if we went up to 3? Oh, so maybe it's 2n plus 1. Okay. So let's actually try this inside the console. So let's say that we wanted the first list that contained the first 2 evens. Well, 2n plus 1 would be 2 times 2 plus 1, which would be 5. So let's see if that'll work. Hopefully this will be 2 and then 4. Oh, it is. What about the first 3 even? So 2 times 3 plus 1 is 7. So 6. So I think our range function is correct. And then here's what we need to do once we are inside the for loop. So sum equals sum plus. You know how this works, of course. This is a variable assignment statement. Python evaluates these right to left. That is, it will compute the value of the expression on the right, and then it will make that the value of the variable on the left. So it will use the current value of sum to compute a value, and then it will make that the new value of sum. It will overwrite the old value of sum. So this is a variable update. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to square that particular even that we have and add that into sum and make that the new value of sum. And then we can simply return the value of sum. And then let's test our code. Because as always, we don't simply write functions, we write them and then we test them with test cases whose outputs we should know. So what would be the sum of the first 0 evens? Well, we don't want to sum up anything at all, so presumably that should be 0. How about the sum of the first 1 even squared? Oh, yeah, sum of squares. So that should be 2 squared, right, which is 4. Ooh, that's right. So how about the first 2 evens squared? Their sum. So that'll be 2 squared plus 4 squared. So that'll be 4 plus 16, which will be 20. And the first 3, I think we saw this one a moment ago, 56. I think that's right. And let's put in some ridiculously large value. I think Python will do this very quickly. Hey, there it is. I have no idea whether that's correct. Well, actually, I do have some idea whether that's correct because I now have confidence in my code. And the confidence that I have in my code makes me confident that this particular output value is correct. That point to the side, however, do notice this pattern. Okay, the pattern is this. We initialized a variable. We started up a for loop, and then once we were inside of that for loop, we updated the value of the variable, and then once the for loop was complete, and notice that the return value is the same level of indentation as the for statement, that is lines 4 and 6, same level of indentation. That means the return value is created once the for loop is complete. Okay, and then once that for loop is complete, we return the final value of the variable that has been updated repeatedly, and we are done.